Today we're actually interviewing Alex Scarrow, who's author of the Timeriders series. His latest book just being out, The Pirate Kings, which is the 7th book in the series, and we welcome you to Birmingham. Can you tell us first a little about the latest Timeriders adventures that you've just released?
The latest book,
Yeah.
the last book that came out, 7th of February I think, is the 7th book in the series, and it's called Timeriders, the Pirate Kings. And as you can guess, it's set very much in the golden age of piracy. And within the series, it's perhaps the last light-hearted romp before things get really quite dark and serious. It's and also a lot of fun having a side swipe at Pirates of the Caribbean. I've had a lot of fun with characters who could be very much how Jack Sparrow might have been if things had been slightly different.
As well as it being an adventure book, you've got quite a sort of educational side to the whole series as well, with the history and with the sort of like the modern events that you've actually brought in. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why that interests you?
Well, as a child and a young adult, I was fascinated by history. I come from a generation where history was taught in a grand narrative. So you started with year dot and you move your way forward in a chronology that makes sense. And because of that, history is taught as a story. And it's a far more interesting process than history is a little bit here, a little bit there, and when you're not sure. It's almost like today, history is a bit like trying to follow a TV series on Sky. You just don't know which season that episodes come from. And because of that, I've had a much greater love for history than perhaps students would today. And Timeriders is set in periods of history that have always fascinated me. And I always decided, when I set the series up, I thought I would stick to periods of history that just basically give me the goosebumps, rather than try and pick periods of history that I'm not familiar with.
If you could actually time travel, which period in time would you actually go to? And is there anything that you would actually change in the past?
Well, there's one particular moment in time where I'd like to be. The Rock of Gibraltar, on the tip of Spain, 38,000 years ago, was part of a peninsula that linked Europe to Africa. Almost a wafer-thin peninsula of rock. And the Mediterranean was a dry basin back then. And this peninsula of rock was holding out the Atlantic Ocean. And they reckon about 38,000 years ago, that just went. And they calculated that the Mediterranean took about 50 years to fill up from the Atlantic. So, kind of like that cartoon Ice Age, where Scrat is pushing that acorn into the... I'd love to be there at the moment that whole thing went. In terms of changing history, that's an interesting one, because there are a lot of nexus points in history that one would like to have steered in a different direction to give us a better world today. And I think one that is very much a theme in Timeriders is 9/11. I think there was a world, you can say, there was a world before that day and a world after. The world before that day, I felt, was a very modern world. We were moving into an era of humanism, where you could say and write anything you wanted. And I feel ever since that day, we've had a very regressive world where there's subjects you cannot write about. The classic one is religion. It's a very, very hot potato now. You just can't do it. You couldn't make films like The Life of Brian today. And I think we can trace it all back to that day in September 2001.
I understand that Neville Shute is one of your favourite authors. What do you particularly like about his stories?
It's more the characters. Neville Shute could depict a character in one sentence. You could just have those 10, 12 words and you know that person. That brevity, that skill, that craft to be able to do that in so few words is just something I've always aspired to.
And which other authors creating today do you actually admire?
There's a writer called China Mieville who writes a form of gothic fantasy that is very literary. I mean, it's right up there. The quality of writing is right up there with Hemingway and Huxley. It's beautiful writing, but sadly, because it's genre fiction, it will never ever be writing that's exposed to the masses. You know, once you get close to genre fiction, you're not going to be touched by a critic.
What do you like most and or least about being an author? What do you like most about being an author first?
Well, I've always been a creative. When I was younger, I was in various rock bands, and after that I was in the games industry. And being in rock bands, every time I used to write a song, we would have fights over it. You're in a team of 5 or 4 in a band, and every time we would try and craft a song, the drummer wants the song to go one way, the lead singer wants the song to go another way. Quite often these resulted in fights with fists. And then in games, I was working in development teams of 100, 150, and to try and get everyone singing from the same hymn sheet was a nightmare. It was a managerial nightmare to try and keep your vision crystal clear and not water it down. Being a writer, you're a team of 1. I've only got to please myself. And I love that. I can move fast that way. I don't have to communicate what I intend. I just can go and do it. What I hate least about writing, I think the frustration that comes when you go into a bookshop these days. It's a shop front for B-list celebrities selling their wares. Yet another B-list celebrity autobiography, and the writers, the real writers, get drowned out in all that noise.
Do you think that libraries are important places?
Libraries, I think, the last remaining bastions, I think, of education. Now, a library is a gymnasium of the mind. You go in there, you can work out that brain, and it's fun. How often can you say working out is fun? And I think that's exactly what a library is.
We've noticed that a lot of books today, and a lot of your books as well, have book trailers. Do you think that book trailers make a difference in getting people to read your books?
I think it can't hurt. You have to shout loud these days to get your book heard. Unless, of course, you're Jamie Oliver. You have to shout loud. And a trailer is one way of shouting. I think you can do some damage to your book if you're putting together a pretty ropey-looking trailer. It has to have a certain level of craft to it. But some of the trailers coming through now have got some real production value to them, and they feel like trailers for movies, which is a great way, then, I think, to entice young readers, because they feel, well, is that a movie? Is it a book? I'm not sure, but if it's a film as well as a book, I'm more interested in the book. What I love, for example, about the covers for the Timeriders books, it's very cleverly done. All the covers look like these are books made of a movie that's already been made. It's like a promotional poster for a movie. Very, very clever.
I understand that when you're writing, a lot of the time you actually sit yourself down in Starbucks and write away with your headphones on, listening to music. As an ex-rocker guitarist, what sort of music actually interests you now, and are you still a rocker?
I'm still a rocker. I still have several guitars back home, and yep, I do dabble about and record music. But when I'm writing, I can't listen to any music that has vocals in it, because basically the lyrics will end up on the page. So what I tend to listen to is film scores. For example, when I was writing Pirates of the Caribbean, I had the Pirates of the Caribbean film score playing in my head. You can't beat that for getting you in the zone. One of my favourite film score composers is a guy called Thomas Newman, who does some really quite quirky soundtracks. He's always top of my playlist.
How do you actually inspire or stoke your imagination? How do you get your imagination going?
How do I get my imagination going? Well, with Timeriders, it's been quite easy, because the whole 9-book series was planned out from the very start. I have a folder at home that's this thick that has all 9 books mapped out in great detail, every single chapter. I mean, I know exactly how the last chapter of the last book goes. I even know how the last sentence of the last book goes. Oh, I won't tell you now. But it means that when I'm sitting down to write, I'm never having to kind of go, oh, what happens next? Give me some inspiration. And it allows me to write quite fast that way as well.
And what do you think is sort of like the coolest or strangest idea that you've included in the Timeriders books?
That's a good question. Well, one of the things that I really liked about the Timeriders series is that the main characters in the series start out being based in New York. And they're based in this bubble of time. They're very much like the movie Groundhog Day. They're in this shielded location where they are preserved from time moving forward, and they basically loop back over and over again. So they're seeing the same 2 days of New York over and over again. And those 2 days are the day before and the day of 9/11. And they're there for a very strategic reason, but it allows them to see, I was talking earlier about the world before and the world after, this nexus point in history. They get to see these two versions of the world as it changes over the space of 24 hours. And it allows a very rich playing out of that theme that surrounds the disaster of that day and how the world is changed by it.
Do you think that your books would interpret well into film? And if there was a film to be made, would you like control over it?
That's a really good question. Hollywood has a long history of turning out really rubbish movies from great books. So I'm very guarded about the film rights. I've said this over and over again. I'd rather no movies were made than something rather rubbish that it turns up on Sci-Fi Channel next year. You know, don't get me wrong. The right director, the right writer, the right production team, the right budget, and I think they would make some great movies. They're very visual. These books are all quite spectacular in terms of the scope and the breadth. And you can see, I think, when you put your producer's hat on, how expensive these movies would be to make. So I think, you know, I've got to be. I am in conversations with some people in Hollywood at the moment, and you know, if they can put together a package that looks like it would be the right series of films, then yeah, I'll be up for that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alex. That's been really brilliant, and I hope that your tour continues and is really, really good.
Well, thank you. Thanks for talking to me.
Okay.
I was playing on the website today with the game, the Splinter game, and having a history of being in the games development industry. Do you think your Timeriders books would work well as a game, and would you like to see them as a game?
Well, funnily enough, some of the ideas that ended up in the series of books were game ideas that I pitched to my bosses when I was working in the industry. The problem was, of course, like the world of movies, the games industry is very sequel-driven and very, very conservative with a small c. So basically, unless your game involves mowing down people with a heavy-powered weapon, it's not going to happen. I think Timeriders can offer a very interesting gameplay device in the way that you might have an obstacle in the present. The way you fix it is not in the present, but going into the past and changing something, going back to the altered present, and then you can proceed. Which is a very fun gameplay metric, I think, to play around with.
That's excellent. And also, do you think you'll ever get a phrase like wibbly wobbly from, like they use in Doctor Who, into your books? Or do you hate that kind of phrase?
Do you know, I shouldn't say this, but I do. I used to be a huge, huge fan of Doctor Who, and I just feel in the last few seasons it's gotten a little bit silly. It's become a little bit of a pantomime. And when the writers can't get out of a plot hole and they have to come up with phrases like wibbly wobbly timiness, then you know that they're in trouble with the internal logic of their world.